The scorching February sun beat down on the asphalt of Greenwich, an upscale neighborhood on the outskirts of New York City, when the executive car pulled up in front of the mansion at number 237. Richard Sterling, a construction magnate, stepped out of the vehicle, his shoulders heavy from having just endured a 12-hour flight. 3 months in Tokyo negotiating partnerships for his construction company had been exhausting but financially rewarding. What he didn't imagine was that the real strain would begin right there as he set foot on American soil. Finally home, he murmured to himself as the driver unloaded the luggage. Among them, a special bag from a toy store in Tokyo, a gift he had bought for his 6-year-old daughter, Julia. Richard paid the driver and took a deep breath before pressing the intercom. No one answered. He tried once, twice, 3 times. The silence on the other side was unsettling. He searched his pocket for the keys and, as he opened the electronic gate, noticed something strange. The mailbox was overflowing, mail scattered across the ground. An electricity bill with a disconnection notice caught his attention. It was then that he heard a child's cry coming from the neighboring house. Something in that sob made his heart race. He looked through the hedge that separated the properties and saw a scene he would never forget. His daughter Julia stood before Mr. Oswald, the grumpy 70-year-old neighbor, known for his impatience with children. The girl wore the yellow dress he had sent by mail the previous month, now dirty and torn at the edges. Her curly hair, usually well groomed by Louisa, his wife, was matted and lifeless. "I told you I have nothing to give you, girl," the old man's hoarse voice echoed. "Go away and don't come back here asking for food. Let your mother take care of you." The man swung the coffee cup in his hand, spilling a few drops near Julia's bare feet, making her flinch back in fright. "Please, Mr. Oswald," the child's voice pleaded. "Just a little piece of bread. Mommy has been sleeping for 2 days." Richard felt his blood boil. In seconds, he was leaping over the low fence that divided the properties. "Julia!" he called, his voice choked with emotion. The girl turned, her thin face lighting up in recognition. "Daddy!" she cried, running towards him with open arms. As he hugged her, Richard realized how light his daughter was, almost too fragile. His heart ached as he felt the girl's ribs beneath the fabric of her dress. Julia smelled of sweat and dirt, none of the lavender scent Louisa always used in her daughter's baths. "She keeps asking for food around the neighborhood," Mr. Oswald said, showing no embarrassment. "I've warned your wife several times, but that woman doesn't open the door for anyone." Richard barely heard the neighbor's words. He held Julia in his arms, examining every detail of her face. Deep, dark circles marked the girl's brown eyes. Her lips were chapped, and there were stains on her skin that seemed to be accumulated dirt. "Where's your mother, princess?" he asked with a calm he was far from feeling. "Sleeping on the sofa," Julia replied with startling naturalness. "She gets tired when she drinks her medicine." Richard dryly thanked the neighbor, promising to resolve the situation, and walked with his daughter in his arms to his house. As he approached the entrance, a putrid odor assailed his nostrils. He reached into his pocket, took out the keys and opened the door. What he saw inside his house looked like a post-apocalyptic movie set. Piles of trash accumulated in the corners, dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the living room table, vodka and wine bottles scattered across the floor. The luxurious Italian leather sofa he had bought the previous year was stained and torn in places. Remains of rotten food attracted flies, and the smell of mold dominated the environment. "Julia, wait here for a minute," he said, gently placing the girl on the only clean spot he found on the veranda sofa. "I'll check on your mother and be right back." Richard walked through the living room, dodging empty packages and scattered clothes. In the main living area, he found Louisa lying on the sofa, semi-conscious. Her once impeccably made-up face was swollen, with smudged mascara around her eyes. Her blonde hair, once her trademark from her photographic modeling days, was greasy and lifeless. An empty imported vodka bottle lay beside the sofa. "Louisa," he called, touching her shoulder. The woman slowly opened her eyes, her expression confused until she focused on her husband. "Richard," she murmured, trying to sit up. You're back? What happened here?" he asked, his voice trembling with contained rage. "How could you let our daughter live in these conditions?" Louisa blinked several times as if trying to organize her thoughts. It wasn't how I planned," she began, her words slurred. At first everything was fine, but then the loneliness, the bills, your mother calling me every day, demanding I pay attention to Julia. Our daughter was begging for food from the neighbors. Richard exploded, unable to control his indignation. Look at this house, Louisa. How did you let it get to this point? Louisa began to cry, thick tears streaming down her face. You don't understand, she sobbed. You're never here. It's always business, trips, meetings. I was alone, Richard, completely alone. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain his composure. He remembered Julia waiting outside for him. I won't argue with you in this state, he decided, turning his back. I'm taking Julia with me. When you're sober, we can talk. Louisa tried to stand, stumbling. You can't take my daughter, she cried, her voice hoarse. You can't just show up after months and take her away. Richard ignored his wife's shouts and returned to the veranda, where Julia waited, huddled on the sofa, her eyes wide with fear. Come on, princess, he said, extending his hand to his daughter. I'm taking you somewhere better. Mommy will be angry, Julia whispered, hesitant. Don't worry about that now, Richard replied, his heart aching. Daddy's here and he's going to take care of you. With Julia in his arms, Richard only grabbed the girl's school backpack, which he found hanging on the coat rack by the entrance. He left the house as Louisa screamed from the doorway, attracting curious glances from the neighbors. He put his daughter in the back seat of the car he had dismissed minutes earlier, but which fortunately was still nearby, and instructed the driver to take them to the Plaza Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Richard looked back one last time. Louisa had collapsed in the middle of the garden, sobbing convulsively. The image of the woman he had once loved, now reduced to that state, would be etched in his memory forever. But his focus now was singular, to protect his daughter, whatever the cost. The room at the Plaza Hotel, with its elegant decor and panoramic view of New York City, contrasted sharply with the reality Richard was facing. Julia slept in the king-size bed after a long bath, which required patience to untangle her hair and clean the accumulated dirt on her skin. Sitting in the armchair by the window, Richard watched his daughter sleep while talking on the phone with Maurice Davies, his lawyer and longtime friend. The situation is extremely serious, Maurice, he explained in a low voice so as not to wake the girl. Julia was practically abandoned. The house was a mess, Louisa completely intoxicated. I need legal guidance and fast. On the other end of the line, the lawyer listened attentively. This is very serious, Richard, Maurice replied. You need to document everything. Take photos of the house, keep any medical records for Julia you can get, and gather neighbor testimonies. I'll prepare a divorce petition with an immediate request for temporary custody. After hanging up, Richard remained motionless, watching his daughter, who was now tossing and turning in bed, apparently caught in a nightmare. He got up and sat on the edge of the mattress, stroking the girl's hair until she calmed down. Silent tears streamed down the businessman's face. How did I not notice before? He murmured to himself. How did I let it get to this point? He remembered the video calls in recent weeks when Louisa always offered excuses not to show Julia. She's at school, she's sleeping, she's playing at a friend's house. And he, absorbed in meetings and contracts, had accepted all the justifications without questioning. His phone vibrated with a message from Maurice. I need you to return to the house tomorrow with a court officer for a formal record of the conditions. I've secured a temporary protective order for Julia. Richard sighed. Going back to that house was the last thing he wanted, but he knew it was necessary to legally protect his daughter. He replied, agreeing, and informed him that he was already arranging a medical appointment for Julia the following morning. At Mount Sinai Hospital, pediatrician Dr. Caroline Hayes examined Julia with attention and concern. She has mild to moderate malnutrition, the doctor informed him after the initial exams. There are signs of neglect in hygiene, and some bruises on her legs and arms consistent with falls. I'll order further tests, but it's clear the child wasn't receiving adequate care. Richard nodded, his heart heavy. She has experienced significant emotional stress, the doctor continued. I recommend immediate psychological counseling. Children at this age can develop anxiety disorders and insecure attachment after traumatic experiences of abandonment. After the consultation, with the medical report in hand, Richard took Julia for ice cream at the mall. It was the first time since he found her that he saw a genuine smile light up his daughter's face. Daddy, can we live in the hotel forever? she asked, licking a scoop of chocolate. Not forever, princess, he replied, stroking her hair, but we'll find a beautiful place for us, I promise. Richard's cell phone rang. It was Louisa. He hesitated but answered, moving away a bit so Julia wouldn't hear the conversation. Where's my daughter? Louisa's voice sounded more sober but laden with anger. You have no right to take her like this. Julia is with me and she's safe, Richard replied, keeping his voice controlled. I won't argue over the phone. My lawyer will contact you. Lawyer? Are you threatening me? Louisa's tone rose. I'm her mother. It was a difficult time, but you can't just... A difficult time, Richard interrupted, trying to contain his indignation. Louisa, our daughter was begging for food from the neighbors. What would have happened if I had taken longer to come back? You don't understand. Louisa's voice trembled. The drinking, it helped me cope with the fear, with the loneliness. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I can change, Richard. Please bring my daughter back. This will have to be decided legally now, he concluded. Julia will stay with me until then. As he hung up, Richard noticed his daughter watching him with attentive eyes, the melting ice cream forgotten in her hand. Mommy's angry? She asked, her voice small. Richard sat back down beside her and wiped the melted ice cream with a napkin. Mommy is confused right now, Ju. She needs help to get better. In the meantime, you'll stay with Daddy, okay? Julia nodded, asking no more questions, and resumed eating her ice cream with a seriousness that shouldn't exist in a 6-year-old. The next day, accompanied by a court officer and Maurice, Richard returned to the mansion in Greenwich. Louisa was not home, which facilitated the formal recording of the property's conditions. The foul smell still permeated the environment, and the cell phone cameras recorded every detail of the neglect. Moldy food in the refrigerator, Julia's scattered and dirty clothes, broken toys, piled up overdue bills, and dozens of empty bottles hidden in various corners of the house. This is more than enough to secure temporary custody, Maurice commented, as he organized the documents in his folder. I'll add the medical report and file the petition today. As they were leaving, an elderly lady approached the gate. It was Mrs. Eleanor, the neighbor across the street, known for her discretion and kindness. Mr. Sterling, she called, her voice trembling with age. May I speak with you for a moment? Richard asked the lawyer and the officer to wait for him and approached the lady. I didn't want to get involved, but, she began, clutching the strap of her purse. I think you need to know some things. I've been watching your daughter these past few months. Richard's heart pounded. Please, Mrs. Eleanor, any information is important. The girl, several nights I saw her outside the house, sometimes late, alone in the garden, the elderly woman recounted. Once it was raining and she took shelter on my porch. She was soaked and hungry. I gave her food and tried to take her home, but she was afraid to wake her mother. Richard closed his eyes, trying to contain his emotion. I have some photos, the lady continued, taking her phone from her purse. My grandson taught me how to use the camera. I started recording because I thought someone might need to know someday. The images Mrs. Eleanor showed made Richard's stomach churn. Julia sleeping curled up on a pool lounge chair, the girl trying to reach fruit from a tree in the neighbor's yard, Julia wearing the same clothes for days on end, getting dirtier each time. Would you be willing to testify if necessary? Maurice asked, having approached. Yes, the elderly woman replied firmly. That child cannot go back to that situation. I should have called Child Protective Services sooner, forgive me. You've helped us immensely now, Richard assured, holding her wrinkled hands in his. Could you please send me these photos? Returning to the hotel that night, Richard found Julia drawing, assisted by the babysitter, Sarah, he had temporarily hired. The girl ran to hug him as soon as he entered the room. Look what I drew, Daddy, she showed proudly. The drawing showed 2 stick figures, one large and one small, holding hands, in front of what looked like a house. A smiling sun was in the corner of the page. It's us, she explained, in our new house. Richard hugged his daughter tightly, tears finally overcoming his resistance. Over Julia's shoulder, he saw his phone on the bedside table flash with new notifications. 15 missed calls from Louisa, and a text message that simply said, "This isn't over." In the 2 weeks that followed, Richard and Julia established a temporary routine at the hotel. In the mornings, Sarah took the girl to sessions with child psychologist Dr. Beatrice, while Richard participated in video conferences to manage his businesses remotely. In the afternoons, father and daughter explored the city. Visits to Central Park, the Bronx Zoo, and the New York aquarium brought some color back to Julia's previously pale cheeks. However, Louisa's shadow constantly loomed over them. The incessant calls turned into text messages that oscillated between desperate pleas and veiled threats. "She's going to use all the money we have to destroy me," one message read. "You'll regret humiliating me this way," another warned. One sunny afternoon, as Richard and Julia returned from a visit to the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, his phone rang. It was Maurice. "We need to talk," the lawyer said, his voice tense. "I just received the response from Louisa's lawyer. She's alleging parental alienation and claiming you prevented her from seeing her daughter. She's also requesting a psychological evaluation of you, implying you have narcissistic personality disorder." Richard looked at Julia, who was playing with a small soccer ball they had bought at the museum shop, oblivious to the conversation. "This is absurd," he replied, lowering his voice. "Parental alienation. I literally saved my daughter from a situation of abandonment." "I know that, and we have proof," Maurice assured. "But she's playing hardball. She hired Roberta Vance, that famous lawyer known for celebrity divorce cases. It seems your mother-in-law is funding the process." Richard wasn't surprised. Margaret Compton, Louisa's mother, had never hidden her disdain for him. Considering him inferior to her daughter, who had been one of the country's most sought-after models before her marriage. "There's one more thing," Maurice continued hesitantly. "Louisa filed for a protective order against you, alleging threats." "What?" Richard almost shouted, startling Julia, who looked at him with apprehension. He smiled to reassure her and moved a few steps away. "What threats? I barely spoke to her." "She presented text messages supposedly sent by you with intimidating content. They're obviously falsified, but we'll have to prove that." Upon hanging up, Richard felt exhausted. What should have been a clear process of protecting his daughter was turning into a legal war. That night, while Julia slept, Richard received a call from the hotel doorman. "Mr. Sterling, there's a lady downstairs insisting on seeing you. She says she's your wife, and she's quite agitated." Richard's blood ran cold. "Don't let her up. I'll come down to deal with it." In the elegant lobby of the Plaza Hotel, Louisa was creating a scene. Dressed in expensive but crumpled clothes and exaggerated makeup, she gestured nervously as she argued with the hotel manager. "She's my daughter. I have a right to see her," she shouted, attracting embarrassed glances from other guests. "Louisa," Richard called, approaching cautiously. "Let's talk outside." Seeing him, Louisa's expression instantly changed to a mask of fury. "Where's Julia?" she demanded to know. "You can't stop me from seeing my own daughter." "You're drunk again," Richard observed, smelling the alcohol emanating from her. "I won't allow Julia to see you in this state." "You don't tell me what to do," Louisa screamed, trying to get past him towards the elevators. "Julia, Mommy's here. Julia!" Hotel security discreetly intervened, and Richard managed to persuade Louisa to calm down and talk in a more secluded corner of the lobby. "What happened to you, Louisa?" he asked, genuinely perplexed. The woman in front of him bore no resemblance to the sophisticated and composed model he had married 8 years earlier. "How did we get to this point?" "You abandoned me, Richard," she accused, her eyes welling up. "Always traveling, always absent. Do you know how much time you spent at home in the last year? Less than 4 months, all days combined. I was alone, raising a daughter, managing a house, enduring your family who never accepted me. Does that justify letting our daughter go hungry?" he questioned incredulously. "Neglecting a 6-year-old child?" "It wasn't like that," Louisa protested, her voice choked. "At first it was just a glass of wine to relax. Then came the sleeping pills because the nights were too long. Before I knew it, I couldn't stop. But I never wanted to hurt Julia, never." "Intention doesn't matter now," Richard retorted. "What matters are the consequences. Julia is traumatized, Louisa. She has nightmares every night, wakes up screaming, afraid of being abandoned again." Louisa collapsed into an armchair, tears now flowing freely. "I'm sick, Richard," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I need help. Please don't take my daughter from me. She's all I have." Richard felt a pang of compassion, remembering the woman he had fallen in love with. But the image of Julia begging for food from the neighbor overshadowed any residual feeling. "You need to get treatment, Louisa, and I need to protect our daughter. If you truly care about Julia, withdraw these absurd accusations and agree to rehabilitation treatment." Louisa looked up, a dangerous glint replacing the tears. My lawyer says I can get custody, she challenged. You were never present. It'll be your word against mine. No, it won't, Richard replied firmly. We have proof, Louisa. Photos, testimonies, medical reports. Don't turn this into a battle you can't win. After Louisa left, escorted by security to a taxi, Richard went up to the room with a heavy heart. Sarah, the babysitter, was waiting, worried. Everything all right, boss? The girl is sleeping peacefully. Richard thanked her and dismissed the babysitter, not without asking her to return earlier the next day. The feeling of insecurity grew after the encounter with Louisa. The next morning, a call from Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly neighbor, made him even more apprehensive. Mr. Sterling, I thought you should know, she said, her voice trembling. Last night, after 10, your wife showed up here with 2 men. They went into the house and stayed there for hours. They left carrying several boxes and suitcases. I heard noises of things breaking. Are you sure it was Louisa? Richard asked, alarmed. Absolutely. And there's more. When they left, she stopped in front of my house and stared for a long time. I think she knows I talked to you. After the call, Richard immediately contacted Morris, who promised to check the situation and, if necessary, request an official inspection of the residence. That afternoon, while Julia watched a cartoon in the hotel room, Richard received a call from an unknown number. When he answered, he heard heavy breathing, followed by a distorted voice. We know where you are. We know about the nosy old woman. Be careful what you do with the girl. The call ended before Richard could respond. With trembling hands, he called Maurice again, reporting the threat. This is serious, Richard, the lawyer warned. We're going to file a police report and request increased security at the hotel. But I think you two need to get out of there as soon as possible. A hotel is too exposed. I have an idea, Richard replied, after a few moments of reflection. My sister Felicity lives in Kennebunkport, Maine. She has an inn secluded from the center, a quiet and safe place. Perfect. The fewer people who know, the better. Don't use credit cards or make reservations in your name. I'll handle all the legal documentation to justify the temporary change of address. That night, as he packed a small suitcase with Julia's essential belongings, Richard noticed his daughter watching him with attentive eyes. Are we going on a trip, Daddy? She asked, hugging the teddy bear she hadn't let go of since they reunited. Yes, Princess, he replied, trying to sound cheerful. We're going to visit Aunt Felicity in Kennebunkport. She has a beautiful inn near the beach. It'll be like a vacation. Is Mommy coming too? The innocent question hit Richard like a punch. No, dear. Mommy needs to stay here to sort some things out. He knelt down to her height. Are you sad about that? Julia shook her head negatively. I get scared when Mommy drinks her medicine. She gets different. She shouts at me. Richard hugged his daughter tightly, feeling anger and sadness in equal measure. You're safe now, Ju. Daddy promises he'll always protect you. As he tucked his daughter into bed, Richard's phone vibrated with a message. It was a photo sent from an unknown number, showing the facade of the Plaza Hotel with a message, Tomorrow won't be a good day for you. Richard watched Julia sleep peacefully and made a decision. They wouldn't wait until dawn. Silently, he called the reception, requesting a private car to pick them up immediately. They left in the early hours, with New York City asleep, leaving behind the comfort of the hotel and the growing sense of danger that surrounded them. The Bromeliad Grove Inn was about 4 miles from Kennebunkport's historic center, in a quiet cove surrounded by Atlantic forest. Managed by Felicity, Richard's younger sister, the place had only 8 rustic and cozy cottages, frequented mainly by couples seeking privacy and contact with nature. When the private car parked in front of the reception, it was already past 10 in the morning. Julia had slept for almost the entire 4.5-hour journey, waking only as the first rays of sun began to illuminate the winding coastal Route 1. Felicity waited on the veranda, her face etched with concern. Thin and with short hair, she had the same brown eyes as her brother, but carried a serenity that contrasted with Richard's visible tension. My goodness, she's so thin, Felicity whispered as she hugged her niece, who, still sleepy, smiled shyly at her aunt. After settling them into the most secluded cottage on the property with an ocean view, Felicity prepared a hearty breakfast, while Richard helped Julia take a bath. Maurice called me last night, Felicity commented, as she poured fresh orange juice. He briefly explained the situation. Richard, how did you not notice before? Richard sighed, running a hand through his hair. I was always traveling, Feli. When I spoke to Louisa on video calls, She always made excuses not to show Julia. I thought it was just scheduling conflicts. I never imagined... His voice trailed off. Felicity squeezed her brother's hand with compassion. Don't torment yourself. The important thing is that you're here now. Julia is safe and no one will find you easily. I used the inn's name for your registration, not your personal name. Julia emerged from her bath wearing a new set of clothes that her aunt had hastily bought, her wet hair falling in curls over her shoulders. Her eyes widened at the sight of the table set with fruits, breads, and cakes. Can I eat all this? She asked, still hesitant. Of course, my love, Felicity replied, fighting back tears, and there's much more in the kitchen. In the days that followed, Julia began to show signs of recovery. Mornings were dedicated to walks along the deserted beach, where the girl collected shells and small sea treasures. In the afternoons, Felicity, who was an art teacher, taught her to paint and mold clay. Evenings were reserved for simple dinners and stories told by candlelight on the cottage deck. Richard, despite his constant worry about the legal process, made sure to participate in every moment with his daughter. He only worked when she was busy with her aunt's art lessons. He watched, amazed, as Julia slowly regained the spontaneity typical of childhood. A week after arriving in Kennebunkport, Felicity suggested enrolling Julia temporarily in the small Rainbow Community School near the inn. She needs to interact with other children, she argued. Besides, a school routine will help her feel normal again. Richard agreed, and Julia began attending classes at Rainbow Community School, where she was warmly welcomed by teacher Nancy, an experienced woman who was discreetly informed about the new student's delicate situation. In the second week in Kennebunkport, Maurice called with news about the case. The conciliation hearing is scheduled for a month from now, he informed. Louisa attended the psychological evaluation ordered by the judge and was diagnosed with depressive disorder and alcohol dependence. The report recommends specialized treatment. What about the threats? Richard asked, moving away so Julia, who was drawing at the veranda table, wouldn't hear the conversation. We filed the police report, but without concrete evidence, it's difficult to proceed. The good news is that the judge maintained temporary custody with you and ruled that any visits from Louisa must be supervised. Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. What about her mother? Margaret Compton is funding the defense as we suspected. She gave some interviews insinuating you're a workaholic and negligent, but that shouldn't influence the process. After hanging up, Richard watched Julia playing with a stray puppy that had appeared at the inn days earlier. The girl had already named him Popcorn, due to the white spots on his brown fur, and pleaded daily for them to adopt him. Aunt Felicity said I can keep him, Julia announced, running towards her father with the puppy in her arms. Can we, Daddy? Please. Seeing the genuine happiness on his daughter's face, Richard couldn't resist. Of course we can, Princess, but you'll have to help take care of him, agreed? The tight hug he received in response was worth more than any words. The peaceful routine established in Kennebunkport was interrupted 3 weeks after their arrival. Upon picking up Julia from school, Richard was approached by teacher Nancy. Mr. Sterling, I need to report something strange, she said, visibly concerned. Yesterday, a woman was watching the children during recess from the other side of the fence. When questioned by the principal, she said she was a tourist interested in learning about American schools. Today, she appeared again and specifically asked about Julia. Richard's blood ran cold. What did this woman look like? Around 50, very elegant, dyed blonde hair, expensive sunglasses. She had a New York accent. The description perfectly matched Margaret Compton, Richard's mother-in-law. No one is to pick up Julia from school except me or my sister Felicity, understood? Under no circumstances. The teacher nodded, concerned. We've already reinforced security. No child leaves without express authorization. Upon returning to the inn, Richard informed Felicity of what had happened, and together they decided to double their vigilance. Cameras were installed at strategic points on the property, and Caleb, the inn's caretaker, was instructed to watch for any suspicious movement. The next morning, Julia found a gift wrapped in colorful paper near the inn's gate, while playing with popcorn. It was an expensive doll, one she had always asked her mother for. Along with it was a simple note, "Mommy loves you and misses you." Richard was alarmed. How had Louisa discovered where they were? He immediately informed Maurice, who promised to file for a more rigorous protective order, alleging harassment and attempted emotional manipulation of the child. The tension increased 2 days later when Caleb found a soaked child's garment attached to the inn's bamboo fence, a yellow dress identical to the one Julia was wearing when Richard found her. The item exuded the distinctive perfume Louisa had always worn. "This is already harassment," Felicity commented, horrified. "She wants to intimidate you." "Or show that she can get close whenever she wants," Richard added, feeling a shiver run down his spine. That night, Richard made a decision. They would no longer take Julia to school until the hearing. Felicity would be in charge of continuing lessons at home, and all outings would be restricted to the inn's property, which now had reinforced security. A week before the hearing, Morris arrived in Kennebunkport to prepare Richard for his testimony. He brought folders with documents, photos, medical reports, and testimonies gathered from the Greenwich neighborhood. "We have a strong case," the lawyer assured, as they reviewed the material on the cottage veranda after Julia had gone to sleep. The social worker's report from the visit to the Greenwich house was damning. Mrs. Eleanor's photos are irrefutable proof of neglect, and Julia's psychological report confirms emotional trauma consistent with abandonment. "What about the provocations here in Kennebunkport?" Richard questioned. "Can we prove it was Louisa?" "Hard to prove directly," Maurice admitted, "but we've added it to the case as attempted emotional coercion, which strengthens our request for strictly supervised visits." The night before the trip to New York City, where the hearing would take place, Richard found Julia sitting on the veranda, watching the stars with popcorn beside her. He approached silently and sat down next to her. "What are you thinking about, Princess?" Julia took a few moments to answer. "Daddy, does Mommy still love me?" The question caught Richard off guard, making his heart ache. "Of course she does, Ju. Mommy loves you very much. She's just sick right now. She needs help to get better." "Like when I had that fever and needed to take medicine?" the girl asked, trying to understand. "More or less, except Mommy's sickness isn't in her body, it's in here," he explained, pointing to his head and heart. "That's why she did things she shouldn't have, like leaving you alone. But that doesn't mean she doesn't love you." Julia nodded, thoughtful. "Can we help her get better?" Richard hugged his daughter, moved by her capacity for compassion, even after all she had been through. "We're trying, Princess. The best help we can give is to hope she accepts the treatment the doctors recommended. And then I can see her again? When it's safe, yes. I promise." Julia smiled, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and looked back at the starry sky. "Look, Daddy, a shooting star, let's make a wish." Richard closed his eyes along with his daughter, both in silence. When he opened them again, Julia was looking at him with a smile. "Do you know what I wished for, Daddy?" "We can't tell or it won't come true," he reminded her, smiling back. "Just a hint then," she insisted. "I wished for us to always be a happy family, even if it's different from before." Richard swallowed the lump in his throat and hugged his daughter tightly. In that moment, under the starry sky of Kennebunkport, he made a silent promise. He would do everything in his power to fulfill Julia's wish to transform that temporary seaside refuge into a permanent home of peace and love. The Superior Court of Manhattan, downtown New York City, buzzed with activity on that rainy Monday in April. Richard held Julia's hand firmly as they walked down the cold, tiled corridor, followed closely by Maurice and Felicity. The girl, dressed in a navy blue dress and white ballet flats, seemed smaller and more fragile under the fluorescent lights of the imposing building. "Remember what we talked about, Princess?" Richard asked, kneeling to be at his daughter's height. "How you'll stay with Aunt Felicity in a special room while Daddy talks to the judge. And Mommy will be there too," Julia asked, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar environment with apprehension. "Yes, she'll be in the room with the judge, but you'll only see her if you want to. And when the court psychologist thinks it's okay, agreed." The girl nodded, clutching to her chest the backpack where she carried her teddy bear and a drawing she had made especially for the occasion. A family portrait that included her father, Popcorn the dog, and a little further away her mother. A social worker approached, introducing herself as Vanessa, and led Julia and Felicity to a special room for children involved in legal proceedings. The space was decorated with bright colors, toys, and books in an attempt to soften the institutional coldness. "She's nervous," Richard commented to Maurice, watching his daughter walk away. "It's natural," the lawyer replied, "but the team is very well prepared. Dr. Helen, the psychologist who will speak with her, specializes in traumatized children. Julia will be in good hands. 20 minutes later, Richard and Maurice were led into the courtroom, where Judge Patricia O'Malley of the Third Family Court was already waiting. On the other side of the room, Louisa sat beside her lawyer, Roberta Vance. Behind them, Margaret Compton, Louisa's mother, stood erect and haughty, as if posing for a magazine photo. Richard avoided looking directly at his ex-wife, but couldn't help but notice how different she seemed. She was visibly thinner, her face pale and without makeup. Her blonde hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore a discreet grey pantsuit, none of the expensive jewelry or accessories she used to flaunt. The judge opened the hearing with a brief recap of the case, listing the documents and evidence presented by both parties. She then addressed Richard directly. "Mr. Sterling, you allege abandonment and neglect on the mother's part, correct? Could you tell us exactly what you found upon returning from your trip?" Richard took a deep breath and recounted, in the steadiest voice he could manage, the devastating scene he had witnessed. Julia begging for food from the neighbor, the house in a state of neglect, Louisa intoxicated and unable to care for her own daughter. "Your Honor cannot imagine what I felt seeing my daughter in that state," he concluded, emotion finally showing in his voice. Julia was malnourished, wearing the same clothes for days, according to neighbors, and afraid of her own mother. When it was Louisa's turn, her voice was low and trembling, almost unrecognizable to Richard, who was accustomed to her always confident tone. "I acknowledge that I failed as a mother," she began, surprising everyone in the room. "I have no excuses for the state in which my daughter was found. The truth is, I've been battling depression for years, ever since Julia's birth, in fact. Alcoholism came later, as a form of self-medication." Louisa's lawyer presented medical reports confirming the diagnosis of untreated postpartum depression that evolved into chronic depression and chemical dependency. Louisa had begun intensive treatment at a specialized clinic soon after Julia was removed from her custody. "My client is not contesting the temporary custody granted to the father," Dr. Vance explained. "What we are asking for is the establishment of regular supervised visits, so that the bond between mother and daughter is not completely broken, and the possibility of reviewing custody after medical proof of Mrs. Sterling's recovery." The judge asked incisive questions to both parties, especially about the family dynamic before Richard's trip. The businessman admitted that his frequent absences may have contributed to Louisa's isolation, but argued that this did not justify neglecting their daughter. "I always maintained daily contact, sent more than enough money for both their support, and on video calls Louisa seemed fine," he defended. "She never mentioned depression or drinking problems." "And you never noticed any signs?" the judge questioned. Richard hesitated. Perhaps I didn't want to see. In recent months, Louisa always had excuses not to show Julia during our calls. The house always appeared dark, with the curtains closed. I should have insisted more. I should have come back sooner." After almost 2 hours of testimonies, the judge called the psychologist who had spoken with Julia. Dr. Helen presented a detailed report on the child's emotional state. "Julia shows clear symptoms of trauma related to abandonment," the professional explained. "She exhibits significant separation anxiety with her father, has frequent nightmares, and developed food hoarding behaviors, hiding pieces of bread and fruit for when I get hungry later, as she herself explained." The psychologist continued. "However, it is important to note that, despite the traumatic experience, Julia still expresses love for her mother. She shows concern for her well-being and expressed a desire to see her, provided that Mommy isn't taking medicine, a reference to alcohol." The judge asked if, in Dr. Helen's professional assessment, it would be beneficial for Julia to resume contact with her mother at this time. "Considering the pre-existing emotional bond and the child's expressed desire, I believe that supervised visits in a neutral environment and with psychological support would be beneficial for Julia's emotional healing process," the psychologist replied. "However, these visits must be introduced gradually and stopped at the first sign of significant discomfort from the child." The hearing was briefly suspended so the judge could analyze the final reports. During the break, Richard remained in the waiting room with Maurice, avoiding any contact with Louisa or her mother. It was with surprise that he saw Margaret Compton approach, while Louisa chatted with her lawyer in another corner. "Can we talk for a minute?" the elegant lady asked, her face impassive like a porcelain mask. Richard hesitated, but Maurice nodded discreetly, and both moved to a more secluded spot in the corridor. "My daughter is truly ill, Richard," Margaret began, her voice controlled. "I'm not here to defend what she did. What happened to Julia is unforgivable." Richard watched in astonishment at the change in his mother-in-law's tone, who had always treated him with veiled hostility. "Louisa is following her treatment diligently," she continued. "Doctors say her depression was worsened by years of neglect, our neglect. I should have noticed the signs. I should have intervened sooner." For the first time, Margaret's composure seemed to falter. "I failed my daughter, just as she failed Julia." "Why are you telling me this, Margaret?" Richard asked, suspicious. "Because, despite our differences, I know you love my granddaughter, and because I want you to know that I do not support any threats or harassment Louisa may have made." She paused, visibly uncomfortable. "When I found out what happened in Kennebunkport, the gift, the clothes on the fence, I confronted Louisa. She denied it, but I found ticket receipts in her name. I withdrew my financial support for the contested part of the process." Richard remained silent, trying to process the revelation. "I'm not asking for forgiveness for my daughter," Margaret concluded. "I only ask that, when she is truly recovered, you allow Julia to have her mother back in her life. Not for Louisa, but for Julia." Before Richard could respond, they were called back into the courtroom. Judge Patricia O'Malley had a grave expression when she resumed speaking. "This is an extremely delicate case, where we need to balance the immediate safety and well-being of the child with her right to maintain family bonds," she began. "Based on the evidence presented, the medical and psychological reports, and the child's own testimony, my decision is as follows." The room fell into absolute silence. "Sole custody of Julia Sterling will remain with the father, Mr. Richard Sterling, with the right to reside wherever he deems appropriate for the child's healthy development." Richard felt immense relief flow through his body, but remained attentive to the judge's next words. "As for Mrs. Louisa Sterling, I grant the right to supervised visits bi-weekly, initially in a therapeutic setting, with progressive duration to be determined by the psychosocial team overseeing the case. These visits are conditioned upon monthly proof of continued treatment for depression and chemical dependency, with reports to be presented to this court," the judge continued, enumerating other conditions. "Louisa must strictly adhere to the established limits for visits. Any attempt at unauthorized contact would result in the immediate suspension of the visitation schedule, and a review of custody would only be considered after 1 year of demonstrably successful treatment." At the end of reading the sentence, the judge looked directly at Richard and Louisa. "I want to make it clear to both of you that this decision primarily aims at Julia's well-being. It is not about punishing or rewarding either parent, but about ensuring that this child can recover from the trauma suffered and grow up in a safe and loving environment." Upon leaving the courtroom, Richard found Felicity and Julia in the waiting room. The girl ran into his arms, and he lifted her into the air, hugging her tightly. "It's all right, Princess," he said, his voice choked. "We can go back to our little house in Kennebunkport." "What about Mommy?" Julia asked, looking over her father's shoulder towards the courtroom door, from which Louisa was emerging, accompanied by her lawyer. Seeing her daughter, Louisa stopped, as if uncertain what to do. Her eyes, red from crying, fixed on Julia with a mixture of love and shame. "Mommy is getting treatment for her illness," Richard explained gently. "When she's better, you'll be able to see each other. The judge allowed it." "Can I say hi to her?" Julia asked. Richard hesitated, looking at the court psychologist who had approached. She nodded discreetly, indicating that a brief contact would be acceptable. With Julia still in his arms, Richard walked over to where Louisa was. At a safe distance, he stopped. "Hi, Mommy," Julia said shyly. "Hi, my love," Louisa replied, her voice trembling, her eyes overflowing with tears. "You're so beautiful." "Daddy said you're sick," the girl continued. "I hope you get better soon." Louisa covered her mouth with her hand, trying to suppress a sob. "Mommy is trying to get better," she managed to say. "Mommy loves you very much, Julia. Never forget that." Richard felt Julia squeeze his shoulders, signaling that the brief encounter was enough for her. Nodding to Louisa, he walked away, taking his daughter away from the tension that permeated the courthouse environment. As they left the courthouse under a fine drizzle falling over New York City, Richard finally allowed himself a sigh of relief. In the car that would take them back to Kennebunkport, Julia quickly fell asleep, exhausted by the day's emotional toll. Felicity, beside him, held her brother's hand. "It's over, Richard," she whispered. "Now you can start anew." Richard looked out the window, observing the grey, bustling city they would soon leave behind. "It's not completely over, Fairly," he replied thoughtfully. "But it's a new beginning, no doubt." As the car sped down the highway towards the coast, Richard made a silent promise. He would turn Julia's trauma into a lesson in resilience and love. The road to recovery would be long, both for his daughter and quite possibly for Louisa. But for the first time in months, he saw a clear path ahead, a path that, he hoped, would lead to the peace they all deserved. 6 months had passed since the hearing at the Superior Court of Manhattan. Winter had given way to spring, and the coast of Kennebunkport displayed an explosion of colors in the gardens and the forest around the Bromeliad Grove Inn. What had begun as a temporary refuge had transformed into a permanent home for Richard and Julia. After the judgment, Richard made a decision that surprised his partners and family. He decided to step down from his position as CEO of the construction company, retaining only a stake on the board, with no involvement in daily operations. Instead, he invested in a small marina near his sister's inn, a business that required his local presence but offered flexible hours to be with Julia. On a sunny Sunday in October, Richard watched his daughter playing on the beach with Popcorn, who had grown and become the girl's inseparable companion. Sitting under the parasol, the businessman worked on his laptop when Felicity approached with 2 cups of coffee. "Working even on Sunday," she teased, sitting in the chair next to him. Richard smiled, closing his computer, "Just answering a few emails. The life of a maritime entrepreneur is much calmer than that of a construction magnate." "Don't you miss it?" Felicity asked, looking at the calm sea of the cove. "The adrenaline of big business, international trips, the status." Richard followed his sister's gaze to where Julia was trying to teach Popcorn to fetch a stick in the shallow water. "Not at all," he replied sincerely. "It took me a long time to realize I was building skyscrapers while my own family was falling apart." They sat in silence for a moment, savoring the coffee and the sea breeze. "I spoke with Maurice yesterday," Felicity commented casually. "He said Louisa completed 6 months of treatment without any relapse." Richard nodded. "I know. The social worker called me last week. They think we can start with slightly longer visits and outside the therapeutic environment." "And how do you feel about that?" "Honestly? Divided." Richard placed his cup in the sand and interlaced his fingers. "On one hand, Julia needs her mother. On the other, I still have nightmares about that day I came back and found her begging for food from the neighbor." "But Louisa seems truly committed to recovery," Felicity pondered. "The supervised visits have been going well, from what you tell me." It was true. In the past 5 months, Louisa had met Julia bi-weekly in a therapy room in Cape Cod, always under the supervision of a psychologist. The first visits had been tense and brief, but gradually mother and daughter were rebuilding a relationship. Different from before, but still significant. "Julia asked yesterday if her mother could visit our house someday," Richard confessed. "She wants to show her new room and introduce Louisa to all the friends she's made at school." Felicity smiled. "Children have an incredible capacity to forgive, don't they? And Julia is so much stronger now. Look how healthy and confident she is." Richard couldn't deny it. Julia's transformation in recent months was impressive. From a scared and distrustful child, she was blossoming into a joyful and sociable girl. At the community school, she had become one of the most participative students, developing a special talent for arts, encouraged by her aunt's lessons. The nightmares, once frequent, were now rare. And the separation anxiety, which made her panic when Richard left his sight, had significantly diminished. "I'm thinking of allowing Louisa to come for lunch next weekend," Richard finally said. "Under supervision, of course. Maybe here on the beach, a neutral environment." Felicity squeezed her brother's shoulder in support. "I think that's a great idea. And you know, the inn is quite quiet next weekend. I can stay with Julia if you want to talk alone with Louisa at some point." Richard nodded, grateful for his sister's understanding. "I have several questions only she can answer. I think I'm finally ready to listen." The following week, Richard arranged the picnic table in the inn's small private cove, while Julia ran back and forth, checking if everything was perfect. "Do you think Mommy will like the lemon pie we made?" the girl asked, adjusting the napkin for the 5th time. "I'm sure she will," Richard replied, admiring the care with which his daughter prepared everything. "It used to be her favorite dessert, remember?" The sound of a car approaching interrupted their conversation. Accompanied by Helen, the psychologist supervising the visits, Louisa arrived punctually at noon. Richard watched her get out of the car, noticing the significant changes in her appearance. Louisa had abandoned the artificial blonde, returning to her natural brown hair, now cut in a shorter, more practical style. Her face, once perpetually made up, displayed a natural beauty enhanced by a slight tan. She wore a simple tunic over linen pants, nothing like the designer clothes she used to wear. "Mommy!" Julia shouted, running towards Louisa, who knelt to receive her daughter's hug. Richard remained by the table, giving space for the moment between mother and daughter. Helen approached him, smiling. "She's really doing well," the psychologist commented in a low voice. 6 months of sobriety, therapy 3 times a week, and she's been actively participating in a support group for mothers with chemical dependency. It's one of the most committed recoveries I've seen." Richard nodded, observing how Louisa listened with genuine interest as Julia told her about her new friend at school and the swimming lessons she had recently started. Lunch proceeded surprisingly smoothly. Julia dominated most of the conversation, eager to tell her mother every detail of her new life in Kennebunkport. Louisa listened attentively, asking questions and showing true interest in her daughter's daily life. "Did you redecorate her room?" Louisa asked Richard, when Julia mentioned the oceanic theme of her new bedroom. "Actually, she chose everything," he replied. "Felicity just helped with the technical part of the painting. Julia has a natural talent for arts." "Like you," Louisa observed, smiling at her daughter. "I remember you always drew when you were little." The comment surprised Richard, who had rarely heard Louisa speak about her past before her fame as a model. After lunch, while Julia showed Helen her favorite spots on the beach, Richard and Louisa remained seated at the table, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. "You've done an incredible job with her," Louisa finally said, breaking the ice. "Julia is happy, healthy. You gave her what I couldn't." "I didn't do it alone," Richard replied, feeling strangely compelled to downplay his merit. "Felicity helped a lot, and Julia is naturally resilient." Louisa nodded, looking at her daughter, who was now running at the water's edge with popcorn. "Even so, you changed your whole life for her. You abandoned your career, the city. I should have done that." "Why didn't you?" The question that had tormented Richard for months finally escaped. "Why did it get to that point, Louisa? I really don't understand." She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "The easy answer would be to blame depression, alcoholism. And yes, those illnesses played a significant role, but the truth is more complicated." Louisa paused, carefully choosing her words. "I never wanted to be a mother, Richard." The confession hit Richard like a punch. "Don't misunderstand me," she quickly continued, seeing his expression. "I love Julia more than anything in this world, but motherhood was never a dream for me. When I got pregnant, I accepted it because you were so happy, and I thought the maternal instinct would come naturally, and it didn't. Not in the way I expected. After Julia was born, I constantly felt inadequate, like I was faking it. All those other mothers seemed to instinctively know what to do, while I felt lost. Postpartum depression made everything worse." "Why did you never tell me?" Richard asked, hurt evident in his voice. "Because I was ashamed. What kind of woman doesn't know how to be a mother? What kind of woman doesn't immediately connect with her baby?" Silent tears began to stream down Louisa's face. "And you were so busy with the construction company, so rarely home. It was easier to pretend everything was fine in the few hours we spent together. So you started drinking." Louisa nodded. "At first it was just a little wine to relax at night after Julia's bath. Then it became vodka because it didn't smell, and then the sleeping pills for anxiety. I was trying to silence the voice in my head that told me I was a terrible mother." She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Ironically, alcohol ended up turning that voice into reality. I became exactly the terrible mother I feared I would be." Richard remained silent, processing the painful confession. Part of him wanted to stay angry, to keep blaming Louisa for everything. It would be easier. But another part recognized his own involvement in the family tragedy. "I also failed, Louisa," he finally admitted. "I was so focused on building an empire, on providing material comfort, that I didn't realize our family was falling apart. All those trips, the late nights working. I left you two alone." "I'm not trying to share the blame," Louisa clarified. "What I did was unforgivable. I just want you to understand how we got there. And where are we now? Richard asked, observing Julia, who had convinced Helen to build a sandcastle. In a better place, I believe. Each of us seeking our healing in our own way. Louisa followed his gaze to their daughter. I'm learning to be the mother Julia deserves, even if from a distance, and you seem to have finally found the balance you always sought. Richard nodded, realizing the truth in her words. I never imagined I'd find peace in a small town managing a marina. And I never imagined I'd find purpose volunteering at a women's rehabilitation center, Louisa revealed. But helping other mothers who are struggling with addiction has been redemptive. Richard looked at her with surprise. You're volunteering? 3 times a week. Part of my recovery program is to give back, and I found that I have a natural ability to connect with these women, perhaps because I know the dark well they're trying to climb out of so well. At that moment, Julia came running back with popcorn by her side and Helen a few steps behind. Daddy, Mommy, come see our castle, she called, pulling both their hands. Side by side, the 3 walked to the water's edge, where an impressive sandcastle was taking shape. Wow, it's amazing, Richard praised, agachándose para examinar as torres detalladas. It was Helen who taught me how to make the windows with little shells, Julia explained proudly. And look, I made the 3 of us here in front. She pointed to 3 small sand figures positioned at the castle entrance. Richard and Louisa exchanged emotional glances over their daughter's head. Both knew they would never again be the traditional family they once were, but perhaps they could build something new, a relationship based on mutual respect and the shared love for Julia. The hours passed quickly, and soon it was time for Louisa to leave. Julia hugged her mother for a long time at farewell. Are you coming back next weekend? The girl asked hopefully. Louisa looked at Richard, who nodded discreetly. If your father agrees, yes, she replied, stroking her daughter's hair. And who knows, when it's warmer, maybe we can go to Oyster Bay together. Remember how you loved to swim there when you were little? Yes, Julia exclaimed, jumping with joy. Daddy, can we? Yes, Princess, we can, Richard agreed. We'll plan it. After the goodbyes, Richard and Julia stood on the beach watching Louisa's car drive away. The girl held her father's hand, thoughtful. Daddy, Mommy's better, isn't she? She is, Ju. She's trying very hard. So she won't drink that bad medicine anymore? She's fighting not to drink anymore, Richard explained, choosing his words with care. It's a difficult illness to cure, but your mother is very determined. Julia nodded, seeming satisfied with the explanation. I prayed every night for her to get better, she revealed. It looks like it worked. Richard smiled, hugging his daughter's shoulders. I'm sure it did, Princess. Walking back to the inn under the setting sun, Richard felt a serenity he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would still be long and at times difficult. Julia would continue to need support to process the trauma she had experienced. Louisa would have to prove day after day her commitment to sobriety, and he himself was still learning to be the present father he always should have been. But at that moment, with Julia singing happily by his side and popcorn running ahead of them, Richard felt a deep certainty. They had survived the storm and were now sailing in calmer waters. As they reached the inn's veranda, they found Felicity waiting with a pitcher of fresh lemonade. The sky was beginning to turn pink and orange, announcing a spectacular sunset. How was it? She asked, pouring a glass for Julia. Richard watched his daughter sip the cold drink, her face illuminated by the simple happiness of the present moment. He remembered the frightened girl he had found begging for food from the neighbor and felt immense gratitude for the journey they had made. It was a beginning, he replied, sitting in the rocking chair. A new beginning for all of us. As the sun disappeared over the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant colors, Richard briefly closed his eyes, absorbing the sounds around him. Julia's laughter playing with popcorn, Felicity's gentle voice telling stories, the distant murmur of waves breaking on the beach, sounds of peace, sounds of home. In that instant, he knew they had found more than a temporary refuge. They had found a path to healing, to forgiveness, and, most importantly, to renewed love that blossoms from the ashes of broken relationships. A love wiser, more mature, and infinitely stronger. Night fell over Kennebunkport, enveloping the small family in its warm embrace. The first stars began to dot the sky, and Julia pointed excitedly to a particularly bright one. Look, Daddy, a shooting star. Let's make a wish. Richard smiled, hugging his daughter. What are you going to wish for this time, Princess? Julia thought for a moment, then smiled with the surprising wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who have faced early difficulties. I don't need to wish for anything, she replied, nestling into her father's lap. My wish has already come true. We are home. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Richard and Julia has touched your hearts. A father who abandoned everything to rebuild the bond with his daughter, a resilient child who found strength to forgive, and a mother seeking redemption, real characters who remind us of the fragility and strength of family ties. To continue experiencing emotions like this, we have a special playlist with other unforgettable stories. Find it by clicking here on the side. If this narrative of overcoming and love touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life and the human capacity to overcome the greatest obstacles. We await you in the comments. Tell us which moment of the story moved you the most, and what other family themes you would like to see in our next tales. Until next time.